to work with World Bank China office. Actually, we're actually starting this webinar tonight. So I'm very pleased we have a very distinguished panelist join us today. And as we all know that the pandemic actually already worldwide has caused 7.6 million cases of infection and over 400,000 fatalities already in over 200 countries in all the regions around the world. So this is really a special time and a crucial time, and we are really all the countries, all the multilateral agencies and institutions are paying great attention to this event. And also that we can see that the World Bank is really in the front end of this pandemic fighting efforts as well. So you have just released this great report on the global prospect for the world economy and on the analysis of the prospect of the global economy. So this is really a great time that we like to have this. So from this report, we actually see that the World Bank actually made a lot of analysis, deep analysis, and also forecast. And the World Bank baseline forecast envisions a 5.2% contraction in the global GDP in 2020. So that is actually the deepest global recession in decades. And this would represent the deepest recession since the World War II, and also the greatest and most economics that have seen the output fall since 1870. So that's really very alarming. So the World Bank actually headed by our Mr. Ayhan Kose, he has led a distinguished group of experts, has just recently released the June 2020 Global Economic Prospects. And it's actually had many in-depth discussions on the impact of crisis and in quite a number of areas. For example, how deep the COVID-19 is affecting the world, and how that will be the informality aggregate the impact of COVID-19, and also the recent development of the advanced economy, also the low economy countries, and also we'll see from the macroeconomic implications, and also the impact of COVID-19 on global value chains. So those are really deep questions that the audience and people and policymakers, academics, the business community are keen to know more in China. As we know that China and the World Bank has worked for a long time. I still remember in the early 1980s that when China joined the World Bank, World Bank has actually financed so many projects in China from the Ertan power station to Xiaolangdi and all those. The most important, the tendering system, the international competitive bidding system, I think World Bank brought into China has really made the Chinese infrastructure market more competitive, and actually more, led to the today. I think World Bank has made a great contribution to that. So we are very keen on the World Bank report, and World Bank report represents probably one of the best international agencies report in the world. And then this is really what we can see from this crisis, and how we can really make this happen. So we are very pleased to be joined by several distinguished World Bank experts tonight. We are also broadcast this live on the Baidu.com and a few other major portals in China. And in Baidu, you can press Chinese for Chinese interpretation, and also you can press the English channel for the English original song. Let me introduce our distinguished panelists today. First, we have Dr. Martin Razor. He's the World Bank Director for China, Mongolia, and Korea. And then we'll have the keynote speakers tonight. Mr. Ayhan Kose, he's the director of the World Bank's Group, Prospects Group, a very well-known forecaster for the world economy. And also we have panelists from the World Bank as well. We have a very strong team of World Bank tonight for the subsequent discussion and Q&A. We have Justin Deman Gounet. He's the senior economist, Development Prospect Group, World Bank. And also we have Catherine Vashak-Madezi. He's the senior country economist, Global Microeconomics Trend. So I want to, on behalf of the Center for China Organization, welcome all of you to take your time out of the special occasion to join us. So I would like to probably first invite our World Bank Director for China, Mongolia, and Korea, Mr. Martin Razor. He's based here in China, in Beijing. And Dr. Martin Razor is the World Bank new country director for China and Mongolia, and a director for Korea. So he looks after not only China, but Mongolia and Korea. So Mr. Razor is leading a team that is managing one of the World Bank's largest loan portfolios, and directs an extensive analytical and advisory program with China and Mongolia, and a growing knowledge partnership with Korea. So he's really active on quite a few fronts. He's fluent in German, English, French, and Portuguese, proficient in Russian, and also some Spanish as a multi-language, multi-dialect. And he has published numerous articles in economic journals and several monographs. Dr. Razor worked for Kiev Institute for the World Economic and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, where he was the director of a country strategy and editor of a transition report. So he's a veteran of almost like in World Bank. Since joining the World Bank in 2003, almost 20 years ago, Mr. Razor held the position as a country manager in Uzbekistan, country director for Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, country director for Turkey, and most recently country director for Brazil. So we're very pleased to have Dr. Razor here to have the opening remarks. So Martin, your time, please.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Henry. I will say Wan Shang Hao to all Chinese listeners, but unfortunately my Chinese does not feature in your list of languages, and the others are much more rusty than it seems when you introduced me. I feel slightly embarrassed. I will need to revise my bio. But it's my great pleasure to introduce Ayhan Kose and Eka Vashakmadze and Justin Demian for this presentation of the global economic prospects. I don't know who it is that said that forecasts are difficult, particularly about the future. But I think this applies with particular salience to the time that we live in at the moment. And it's an unusual time when all forecasters feel the need to operate in scenarios with a much wider range of uncertainty than usual over most of the economic aggregates. And it's in that environment that this global economic prospects tries to navigate through what is a particularly challenging set of circumstances and variables to try and put together to get a sense of what lies in store for the world economy. And I think the analysis of the report offers a lot of insights into the variables that we might want to look at. The public health response and the extent to which it manages to bring the epidemic under control so that supply restrictions can be lifted. And in that regard, I think there's a particular interest here in East Asia, because I think by and large we can state that East Asia has done a pretty good job in bringing the pandemic under control. And new infection numbers in the region are relatively low pretty much in all countries. There are some exceptions here or there. So supply restrictions should no longer be the main binding constraint in many of the countries. But they're faced with an integrated global economy in which even when you have brought the epidemic under control, you may not have markets to sell to because the shock to incomes and the shock to your trading partners has been such that you may be able to produce, but you may not be able to sell. And those interlinkages are very well analyzed, I think, in the report. And it will be interesting to hear how the team evaluates the particular position of a country like China that is, I think, quite typical for what I just described, the country that no longer faces supply constraints, but faces demand constraints, and what might be some of the steps that countries can take that are in that particular situation. What are the implications for value chains in the region, but also globally? I think those are some of the issues that will be of interest to the audience in this part of the world. There is also interesting analysis about potential hysteresis effects of the crisis. What happens when there is this size of shock? Is it something that is temporary, or will it leave permanent scars? On the other hand, I think we're also seeing in places like China, but not only here, that the crisis may well serve as an accelerator, as a catalyst for changes in technologies. The growing importance of e-commerce and other applications of modern digital technology may accelerate and may leave permanent changes to the structure of the economy that may be good for some and not so good for others. So there are distributional issues to consider as the economy is emerging from this shock. And then finally, I think there are important questions whether this crisis is an opportunity to also initiate some more fundamental policy changes, never mind the technological changes that may be spawned by this event. There are also policy changes that may be of long-lasting nature. Perhaps the most prominent is the discussion about how we can make sure that we build back better, that we use this opportunity to make a more decisive move towards greening the path of economic growth. And this is, I think, a central question for China as it moves towards the 14th five-year plan. But there are also questions in terms of social policy. Is this crisis an opportunity to put in place stronger safety nets in countries such as China that allow the country to better cushion the livelihoods of people in a world that is potentially going to face similar crises again in the future? And as a result of the strong integration across countries, these crises are increasingly propagated, and no country is isolated from what happens in the rest of the world. So these are many of the questions that are being addressed in the Global Economic Prospects report. Let me not say much more. I think Dr. Kose is going to take us through the main findings of the report, and then I really look forward in particular to any questions that our audience has that may, on the points of the report that may resonate in particular in this part of the world. So thank you very much, Henry, for giving us this opportunity, and to CCG for hosting this event. We look forward to hosting many more events with you in the future. And now let me pass it back to you and to my colleagues for the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for your excellent opening remarks. I think you have really highlighted quite a bit of the importance of this global prospect report, because we actually facing unprecedented, coronavirus and affecting the global economy of such magnitude, of such a large size that never presented to us in the history of mankind. We have such a large economy, unprecedented, and the World Bank being the most active and also probably the first rate of economic analysis, and also have a strong history of World Bank in China. So your research and your findings will have a lot of implications and a lot of stimulating thoughts for the Chinese economy and world economy as a general. So we are very fortunate that we have the group of distinguished panelists actually giving us the highlight of your report. And I know that you just released the report, and this report has got worldwide attention. I already read some of impact of that, and I know that Chinese local coverage has some of that. But we want to hear from our key authors of this report, and we'd love to hear from Dr. Kose directly. So this is really a good time to introduce him. So Dr. Ayhan Kose is the director of World Bank Group's Prospect Group. And Dr. Kose is the director of this group. And in this capacity, he leads the World Bank Group's the works on the global macroeconomic outlook and financial flows and commodity markets. So it's quite active. So under his management, the Prospect Group produced the bank's corporate flagship report, Global Economic Prospect. So this is really World Bank flagship report. And in addition to other monitoring and analytical publications. Also, Dr. Kose has a very impressive resume. Prior to his joining World Bank in 2014, he was assistant to the director of the research department and deputy chief of the multilateral surveillance division in the International Monetary Fund. And Dr. Kose is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research, a Dean's Fellow at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business, and a research associate at the Center for Applied Microeconomics. He has taught at the University of Chicago and INSEAD, and was formerly assistant professor at the Brandeis International Business School. So I have to cut it there because I think Dr. Kose has a very impressive background on those issues. So perhaps without further ado, we'll have Dr. Kose to give us the feature presentation tonight. Dr. Kose, may I have your start, please?
Thank you, Henry, and good evening, everyone in China. I would like to extend my appreciation to Henry and his colleagues for hosting us. We released the report on the 8th, our forecast, and actually this is the first outreach event we are organizing in China. And I'm very happy that our country director, Dr. Reiser, is here with us. And I have two of my colleagues, Justin Demian Gunet and Ekaterina Vashakmadze. They are ready to answer questions on certain issues. They worked on important parts of this report. Let me have this very quick presentation. I'm gonna share my screen, but it looks like I am unable to share my screen. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. So in the meantime, let me start. Maybe we can fix that issue before we proceed. This edition of Global Economic Prospects has a number of chapters. Every Global Economic Prospects report comes with global outlook. Of course, we have the forecasts of countries we monitor, and then the regional outlook. So we have a dedicated section for East Asia Pacific in this report, in fact, produced by my colleague, Eka Vashakmadze. She's here with us today. In addition to these outlook chapters, we have the analytical pieces. One of these analytical pieces looks at how deep this episode relative to previous episodes, in the sense that there have been global recessions before, how deep this COVID-19 global recession, if you look at the global recessions, the world economy experienced since 1870. And then, as Henry mentioned, we have a piece on global value chains, another piece on how, you know, informality that's rampant in many of these emerging market developing economies we operate in aggravates the problem of the corona pandemic. Martin mentioned, Dr. Reiser mentioned this chapter about the long-term consequences of the pandemic. So now I can share my screen.
That's good. We can see it.
Excellent. Thank you. So we are looking at the, you know, what are the long-term implications of the pandemic, whether there are some, you know, the long-term damage. And we also have a piece, what is the impact of having this oil so cheap during the kind of the pandemic? Will it help the global economy to recover? Now, what I would like to do today, I would like to focus on the very quickly questions around the mainly three issues here. First, what are global growth prospects in the near term? And the answer is that we will see the deepest and most synchronized global recession since the Second World War. This will be the first recession in emerging market developing economies on record. The data goes back all the way to 1960, and the risks tilted to the downside. I will explain these things in detail. The second question, what are the likely long-term implications of COVID-19? The big issue we need to worry about is this weaker potential output. Whenever you have these types of deep recessions, you end up with the weak potential output, so that your ability to grow gets curtailed. You end up with weaker investment and productivity over the long term. As I mentioned, the report looks at the impact of cheap oil on global growth. We basically think that there is not much of a large impact. If there is an impact, that's going to be marginal during the early part of the recovery. We do expect a very sharp downturn in oil exporting in emerging market developing economies. And then I will conclude with this message about policy priorities and continue with Q&A session. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to use this acronym EMDEs, Emerging Market and Developing Economies. So let me start with the first question. When you think about the pandemic we faced, we did have the types of, you know, events very rarely in history. There was this 1918 Spanish flu, but we never had the type of policy response around the world, in the sense that when you look at what happened is that there was a very extensive set of measures to stem the pandemic. You look at, for example, school closures that affected almost 100% of global GDP. If you look at, you know, event cancellations, there was close to 95% of GDP. In response to these, there are these, you know, standard mobility indicators. Basically, these mobility indicators suggest that the activity collapsed around the world, and you can look at the, you know, the transit activity, you can look at the retail activity. In a very short time period, we saw the indicators of activity collapsing more than 50%, in some cases 70, 80, 90%, depending on the country. So in response to these measures, the policy measures to stem the pandemic, that were necessary measures. We saw across the board a collapse in economic activity, in trade, and of course the capital flows and commodity prices. For example, if you look at the net new export orders, this is a high frequency indicator. You see that in April 2020, we saw basically the largest 1 month decline in new export orders. If you look at tourist arrivals, again, we saw the largest collapse in March. And in some cases, this was basically a 100% collapse because the countries closed their borders. In the case of portfolio inflows in emerging developing economies, we saw the largest net portfolio inflow decline since 2005. And of course, in the case of price of oil, we saw things we have never seen. And in March 2020, we saw the largest 1 month collapse in oil prices. So what are all these things tell us? In response to the collapse in activity, policymakers around the world responded aggressively. They provided large-scale measures of fiscal accommodation as well as monetary accommodation. Despite this large-scale accommodation, we are expecting the deepest global recession since Second World War. As Henry already mentioned, we are expecting this year a contraction of global economy by about 5.2%. This contraction will be even larger in advanced economies. It will be around 7%. In the case of emerging market developing economies, something historical will happen, and I think that was kind of that's an unfortunate outcome. However you look at it, these economies as a group, they were able to produce growth year in, year out, but this year they are going to contract for the first time in recorded history. We have data all the way back to 1960. As you can imagine, there is all types of composition issues here. We expect them to contract 2.5%. I'm going to put these things in historical context, but when you look at the regional outcomes, what you see is that East Asia Pacific is the only region this year we expect positive growth, 0.5%. And that's because we are expecting China, despite the environment, the global environment, to deliver positive growth this year. And China will be actually the only major economy delivering positive growth by about 1%. In other regions, depending on these regions' exposure to the global economy, things look quite different, but across the board, you see contractions in all regions except East Asia Pacific. Take, for example, Latin America and Caribbean. This region will have its deepest contraction since 1960, as well as the deepest contraction we see in all emerging developing economy regions. We are working on these 6 regions. So the region will contract by about 7%. Why? This is a region, it has strong, of course, trade relations with major economies like the United States, as well as China, both of them going to see significant slowdowns or contractions. It relies on commodities. There are a number of major commodity producers in this region, and we are expecting commodity prices collapse. As you know, I talked about already oil. The region is a major tourist destination. Of course, the tourist arrivals basically went down to 0, and hopefully it will pick up in coming months as countries normalize. And of course, the region also receives quite a bit of remittances by its workers abroad, and those remittance inflows at the global scale, we expect this year to be lower by about 20%. So, however you look at it, a region like Latin America that also relies quite extensively on international financial flows will end up seeing a significant contraction it has never experienced before. There are some other regions like Europe, Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa. They will also see very large contractions. Even a region like South Asia, that's a region composed of commodity importers, you would expect to take advantage of cheap commodities, will end up seeing a contraction by about 2.7% because we expect this large economy in the region, India, to see a substantial decline in growth, in fact, experience a recession. In the case of Sub-Saharan Africa as well, we are expecting a contraction in economic activity, in incomes across the board. Of course, in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, the region has a lot of challenges in terms of limited health care capacity, as well as rampant, as I mentioned, the informality, making the kind of the policy response on the health side as well as the fiscal side difficult to keep the economies afloat. Now, let me put this, global recession we identified in context by looking at this previous episode. In the report, we look at the data from 1870 and identify 14 global recession episodes. These global recession episodes simply describe periods when global economy experienced per capita income contraction, per capita output contraction in a specific year. So there were 14 such years. The last one is going to be 2020. When you look at these 14 episodes, the first thing you realize about 2020, it is the first global recession triggered solely by a pandemic. There is this episode, 1917, 1921. That episode also coincided with the Spanish flu pandemic, but was also influenced by, of course, the First World War. And the research suggests that actually the World War was a bigger influencer of the outcomes of that global recession. The second important observation is that the 2020 COVID-19 global recession will be the deepest one since the one global economy had right after the Second World War. The Second World War, this episode, this 1945 and the 46, was an outcome of demobilization of the kind of the stimulus put in place, and that led to the collapse in activity. The third important observation is that 2020 episode, when we look at these 14 episodes, is the fourth deepest one. So we will think about, we will study more, but our early diagnosis about this global recession, it has its own leak. It is a truly, devastating, exceptional episode when you compare with previous ones. One other characteristics of this episode is it is rich, in the sense that if you look at what fraction of economies was in recession in every global recession episode, you see that 2020 will be recorded, according to our forecast, is the most synchronized global recession the world economy experienced. This year, we will see close to 95% of countries experiencing contractions in per capita GDP. This is even higher than what we saw at the height of Great Depression. Now, there are many risks, and all these risks point to downside outcomes. So our 5.2% headline number could be lower and we think that that's a higher probability than to see a, a better number than that. The biggest downside risk, of course, a more protracted pandemic. We might see a second wave of infections. We might see, of course, the local outbreaks that curtail the activity in different parts of the world. If these types of risks materialize, you might end up seeing, of course, the financial crisis. There are risks associated with trade tensions. And there is also the question whether the policy support, as much as it is large, would have the type of effectiveness that's necessary to basically keep the economy going. And over the long term, there are multiple risks. I'm going to focus on one important risk. That risk is that even larger than expected adverse impact on potential growth. Now, where are we in the pandemic? This is an important question to understand very quickly. As you can see, advanced economies are now on the other side of the curve in terms of daily new infections. In the case of China, the pandemic has been under control now for some time. But if you take out China and look at emerging market developing economies, the number of infections is rising at a very rapid pace, especially in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia. And we are worried about these regions because their ability to test, their ability to contain the pandemic is rather meager in comparison with some other regions. So as much as the number of infections has been going down in advanced economies as a group, it has been increasing rapidly in emerging market developing economies, except China. Now, I mentioned that growth prospects are quite fragile because of these downside risks and much weaker outcomes possible. So in the report, we look at these outcomes and look at what we would see if these types of outcomes materialize. One important observation is that if we see a more protracted pandemic around the world, and if that comes with financial crisis, financial stress in multiple economies, then we might end up with a much weaker growth outcome. In fact, we might end up with a deeper contraction, and that contraction we think could be around -8% this year. So the headline number is -5.2, but we might end up with -8. If that happens in advanced economies, we might see growth going down -10, and emerging market developing economies growth might be around -5. Now, having said that, there is large uncertainty, and we also consider a good scenario, for the lack of a better word, or an upside risk scenario. If global economy collectively contains the pandemic, then there is a possibility that we will see a more moderate global recession. But even under that scenario, the global growth we think will be around -4%, which is still 2 times larger than what we had during the global financial crisis. Now, as Martin mentioned, the uncertainty around these forecasts is very, very large, especially during this period. In fact, the figure on the right shows you we are facing uncertainty in forecasts here measured as dispersion in consensus forecast. We have never seen before, even during the global financial crisis. So we will continue monitoring these developments and adjust our forecast. Let me turn to the second question. What are the likely long-term implications? And there, the big issue we need to worry about is how the decline in investment, the investment of course collapse as output collapse, and the basically decline in the pace of human capital accumulation would ultimately impact potential output. So to think about these issues, we employed a wide range of econometric models. The basic idea is very simple. We know that in the short term, you will end up with much lower economic growth and activity will be much smaller. The question is that how this will affect the economy's ability to produce growth, which is basically the potential growth, the type of growth the economy is able to deliver when it fully utilizes its resources at the kind of the maximum technological frontier. And when we did that exercise, what we saw is that whenever there is a severe recession, you end up with a decline in potential output. For example, if you look at what happens to potential output in recessions, in a typical recession, you will end up with, give and take, 5% decline after 4 years in potential output. If that recession coincides with a financial crisis, that decline increases 8%. So this another way to think about this. Of course, when will the economy go back to its trend level of output it was able to produce prior to this pandemic? And these results tell you it will take a very long time, and it might be the case that we will never recoup what we lost because of this pandemic. And we also focused on the following question: what happens to investment and productivity after epidemics? We look at the case of SARS, MERS, Ebola, and Zika. And when these types of events took place, relative to other events, there is damage, and that damage is there for an extended period of time. In the context of investment, that damage is around 10%. In the case of the labor productivity, after 5 years, you see the labor productivity is lower by about 6%. Why these types of outcomes take place? Of course, one important reason is that there is the slowing on of potential growth. And we all need to remember, global economy was already fragile before it received this pandemic shock, in the sense that we had the lowest growth since the global financial crisis last year at the global level. But we also had a prolonged period of a slowdown in potential growth. On top of that, this year, we'll see a collapse in investment that will affect capital accumulation. Of course, the types of uncertainty associated with pandemic will affect investment in coming years. But also, when you look at the school closures around the world, that has a direct impact on accumulation of human capital, especially in low-income countries, in emerging market developing economies. Our calculations suggest around 160 million children at some point were not going to school, and basically this is a direct negative shock to the accumulation of human capital because their education is disrupted. Above and beyond, when these types of events take place, because of the slowdown in human capital accumulation, the physical capital accumulation, consequences for investment, consequences for basically labor productivity have long-lasting effects. The bottom line is that there will be lasting scars associated with this episode. Let me skip this question about oil and go to the final question. What are the policy priorities to address this really devastating event? And there, our policy message is very clear. Policymakers need to address the immediate health crisis and find ways to keep the economies going. That means reaching out to vulnerable households, reaching out to viable firms, providing the type of support that is necessary. At the same time, it is important, as Martin mentioned, take advantage of this crisis. Think about what type of future we want for these generations to come and pursue reforms to reignite growth. As I mentioned, potential growth will be adversely affected. It is critical to find ways to promote growth prospects, and hopefully, those growth prospects are going to be climate friendly. Enhancing debt and investment transparency more critical today than ever, given the uncertainty, given the low level of confidence around the world, and coordinating policies globally is critical. Now, I have a long list of policy priorities here, and of course, whenever these types of events take place, there are tendencies to impose protectionist measures. At this juncture, it is critical countries coordinate policies globally to ensure smooth flow of critical goods, including goods related to medical equipment and others. And as you know, the World Bank and the IMF work with G20 has this debt relief initiative for the poor emerging market developing economies. We think that we will have serious challenges associated with the payments of these liabilities by emerging market developing economies, especially these poorest ones. It will be important to continue providing the necessary support. And of course, I talked about these long-term growth issues and the critical role policies should play long-term growth prospects. In this context, it is also critical to coordinate policies globally to address global challenges, including those related to public health and information transparency, global trade and financial system, and climate change. I think it is very clear this pandemic taught us we need to be alert to the types of risks. Even we think that those risks are at the tail, very difficult to materialize. Risks do materialize, pandemics do happen, and we might end up with, challenges related to climate down the road. We are not now thinking in near-term calculations. It is important to understand the lessons from this episode. As much as it is a rare one, it happens, the global community needs to undertake measures. So let me quickly sum up. The first question I ask, what are global growth prospects in the near term? We are experiencing the deepest and most synchronized global recession since the Second World War. This is the first recession in emerging market developing economies, we think, on record, and risks tilted to we will see weak and risk tilted. What are the likelihood over the long term relative to what we were thinking prior to the crisis? And I also talked about policy priorities, and there policymakers need to address the immediate health crisis problem. They need to be timely, aggressive, comprehensive in their policy responses, and they need to coordinate their policies. Now, let me question, what will be the shape of the recovery? So in 2009, when there was a global recession, I was economist actually in the IMF at that time. And I remember many shapes were proposed at that time as well. For example, a number of people at that time proposed a V-shape, W, a U-shape recovery. There was the kind of the idea that the recovery was going to be L-shaped. Some thought that it will be a saxophone-shaped recovery. Some others said, no, no, it's going to be a bathtub-shaped recovery. Some said, no, it will be an inverse square root. Some said it's going to be Z-shaped. And now there is this idea, this swoosh-shaped recovery. I think these types of discussions always basically miss the, and now swoosh-shape, this recession is very, very damaging. This recovery will be a slow one. We cannot basically describe the recovery with these, simplistic characterizations. But we can do one thing. We can be very aggressive in our policy response. We can be timely in our policy response, and we can be comprehensive in our policy response. Let me end with a quick promotion. I invite all of you to visit our webpage, look at our publications, Global Economic Prospects. We release 2 times a year, January and June. We have Commodity Markets Outlook in April and October, and there is a monthly publication the World Bank produces called Global Developments in the year. We also have detailed analytical studies. In one of these, we looked at actually what happened since the last global recession. This is a study a decade after the global recession. And we have a very new study, Global Waves of Debt, looks at the debt dynamics, which is going to be an important topic we will focus on, I think, in the years to come, given that how much debt is accumulated around the world. But let me stop here and thank you for the opportunity to present our views here in Beijing virtually.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kose, for your excellent and comprehensive presentation of your the key report, which we found very fascinating and stimulating, and but also depressing to see that as well when the whole world economy is really facing a downturn on that. As you said, the steepest decline in the export, tourism, oil price, and many other areas. So it's really we're unfortunate to see that. But what I think that you have some good spot as well. That we see that developed economy, we have 7% contraction as well, but world average is about 5%. East Asia, we have, and the Pacific, we have 0.5%, and then we have the China, we have 1%. So we would like to maybe we're getting to some discussions. We have collected a lot of questions, and also someone may ask directly. And also that we have actually, currently we have over 300,000 viewers online from Baidu, Phoenix, Sina, and all those different portals that we are broadcasting. so maybe I'll start with one question, and then we somehow I see Dr. Kose is still talking. Are you still talking?
I think it's the delay in the picture, Henry. I have the same impression, but I had this on another Zoom call between China and the US the other day. It seems that the tone travels faster than the picture. So we see the picture of a few minutes ago.
All right. Okay. Good. Yeah, I think one of the good things that you have also proposed so many policy recommendations and suggestions, which is fascinating to see that World Bank has actually mentioned about support the health system, aid vulnerable groups and support viable business, and also you talk about particularly coordinated policy globally to provide debt relief to poor and emerging markets, but also coordinating global policies to fight to really strengthen the trade, also to really get rid of those barriers on the medical support and things like that. So really great to hear all your fascinating findings that World Bank has really have done a systematic approach to this. So one question I may start is that for Dr. Kose is that you have mentioned about the world average is about 5.2% contraction, and then developed countries is about 7.7%, and East Asia is 0.5 positive, and China is probably 1% as well. So the reason for that kind of a forecasting or assessment is that based also on the pandemic that, for example, China has quickly contained that, and then the number of affected cases is almost disappearing here in China, and then also, of course, China already started to resume the production enterprises. So why do you come to that conclusion that China probably have 1% and doing better on that? What's your assessment?
Thank you, Henry. I think our China forecast, this positive number, as I mentioned, all advanced economies are contracting. All major emerging developing economies except China contracting. We still China to deliver growth. I will ask my colleagues to also provide their insight. The first reason is that, of course, China had the kind of the crisis earlier than other economies and contain it quite quickly. Second, China has the chance to stimulate activity more. Of course, that type of response will have consequences of that. And I think we also see China or respond just of opening up. The big issue down the road, how this external environment would affect China in terms of while activity in the rest of the world, activity will be stalling. And that basically brings us this forecast. But let me stop here and ask our China senior economist, the EAP, East Asia Pacific senior economist, Eka Başakmadze.
Okay, thank you. That's great. So
and
we
of
can,
course, Mark observation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Eka?
Yes. So very quickly on China in particular and East Asia too. As Ayhan said, we are observing, right? First of all, there was clearly this lockdown imposed in China, but very quickly, towards the end of February, already in March, we have been seeing resumption of activity. And this is we are seeing also in the rest of the region. Actually, the region proves again resilience. First of all, it started this crisis on stronger footage, because China, even before the crisis, was growing already closer to 5%. And then also clearly the policy buffers that China had and that it deployed in a timely manner and very effectively helped this more quicker recovery. I will stop here.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Martin, you follow the economy on the ground. You are there. How you see China and our forecast 1%?
Well, I think our forecast is our forecast based on the information we have so far. As I said earlier, this is subject to significant uncertainty. And I think with respect to the global outlook, the uncertainty points to the balance of risks being more on the downside. But with respect to China itself, I think the high frequency data point to, a mixed picture. I mean, there are some positive indicators with respect to domestic demand. You see some of the services and construction PMIs moving up. And on the other hand, you see continued difficulties with respect to export orders. So I think we're just going to have to continue to watch this very closely. We will have another opportunity to look at our forecast when we publish the China economic update, which is due in the next few weeks. But these are unusually uncertain times, and so I think it's for now the 1% looks like the best the best point estimate that we can come up with. But it is subject to all of the uncertainties that you mentioned in your presentation. And in China's case, I think I would say that the risks are probably evenly balanced at this point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Martin. I think that both of you have given all of you given very good explanations. But I do think China, because it has one of the first countries to contain virus swiftly and quickly with the government's strong determination, and also to really restart the economy very fast. And so that is also one of the earliest. So I think, and also given the efficiency of the market and also the magnitude of the size, and China has an advantage of cover that, particularly with government strong views and support and policy coordination as well. And with China's 2 sections just finished, and there's a new motivation on all sectors in China to do well. I think it's really a balance to draw on that as well. To contain the virus at the same time, but also let production get back as normal as possible. So World Bank's report would definitely shed some good light on the Chinese economy. So we'll see that. That's really great. I mean, so we haven't seen anybody forecast China. Even the Chinese government hasn't forecast on that. But I'm glad to see World Bank gave a positive number on that, which is while the whole world is in negative. So this is really encouraging to hear that. We actually have one of our council member is he's the senior manager of overseas government affairs, but he's from one of the largest auto ride company in China, like Uber. It's a Didi Chuxin. So Pen Meiling, maybe now he can propose a question. Or maybe, okay, my colleagues advised me also. Wang Yanping also wants to raise a question as well. So why don't I let our staff to let them ask questions? but actually now we have quite a number of viewers online,
Yeah.
and so.
Hello,
Yeah.
can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. Please
Yes.
go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Henry Wang, for the opportunity, and thank you very much for His Excellency Mr. Ayhan Kose and distinguished guest from World Bank. This is Yan Ping from LinkedIn, actually partner with World Bank, both World Bank and CCG. So in this increasingly chaotic world impacted by the pandemic. So LinkedIn is trying to use our platform and our data to envision the development and trend of talent and labor force mobility and other characters. So my question for Mr. Ayhan Kose is, could you please provide some advice for university students, especially for those who are expected to graduate this year? Because we know that in this situation, it is very challenging for graduate students to find a job, and they are lack of a social network, a lack of experience, and the number of the new graduates is huge. So I'd like to invite your advice for this question. Thank you very much.
Okay, this is Yan Ping Wang. He's actually from the LinkedIn in China. So the question he just asked.
So the now job market is obviously going through the kind of this unprecedented shock around the world. Here in the United States, the unemployment rate reached the levels last time we saw during the Great Depression. And we see a kind of a rapid rate of unemployment as well. Now, if you are a college student getting ready to graduate, of course, this job market presents the most formidable challenge in generations. Nevertheless, I think whatever you are doing, you would like to be the best in the field, build your human capital, and then in terms of job opportunities, be flexible in what you are assessing, think through the kind of the possibilities. There is this idea that never waste a crisis. Every crisis brings opportunities. What those opportunities are, we will learn down the road. Obviously now the activity related to digital technologies is premium. It's going to be important. It's going to be important thinking about these fields, the new and emerging fields in this area, and how this has spillovers to other professions. But what we are doing at the World Bank, trying to help on the health front, the more as an individual, as a country as well, having the kind of healthy population, having a good, superb health system, able to respond to the threats, as well as having a flexible education system, because new generations will require different type of digital technologies and their use, and we help our member market developing economies, especially of course, to improve their health response to the crisis, as well as to improve their response in the context of education policy. But let me stop there.
Okay, Dr. Kose, it seems a little sound problem. Yeah, and anyway, we heard your answer. I think actually it's fascinating. You know, China now has this online infrastructure and e-commerce and digital. You know, 1 billion smartphone users. So that helps quite a bit also. Online education, online conference, online delivery, and online entertainment. That actually helped China as one of the big, probably one of the biggest advantage actually we find during this pandemic that really pushed China on more sustainable fight to the COVID-19. So thank you for your question. So that probably also, you know, keep a lot of people busy, employed at home probably as well. We have actually another question from China, from China Business News. Perhaps they can start to ask. So.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is, the first question is, after this coronavirus crisis, will it be more difficult for emerging markets and developing economies to continue to integrate into global value chains? And second question is, do you think the world is heading to regionalism rather than a deeper globalization? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question from China Business Network's news. So perhaps, I don't know, any of you would like to address those two questions. One is that would the developing countries, emerging market continue to integrate in the global value chain if they it would be difficult for that after this pandemic? And also second question is the world is heading to the regionalism rather than globalization. Perhaps JD, you want to answer some of those questions?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear. We can hear.
Oh, thank you. So let me quickly provide perspective on this. This is one of the actually risks we discussed in the report. Risks of deglobalization associated with these disruptions in global value chains and possibility of, you know, extended period affecting cross-border trade and having a kind of a impact on integration process. Now, one thing countries learn, they need to diversify the sources of inputs as there were, you know, border closures, there were interruptions in supply chains, value chains evolve in coming months. The extent of their, you know, expansion has been slowing. We released a report, World Development Report, looking at this issue. In terms of regionalization venues and pursue the trade liberalization initiatives and understand the value of, you know, how trade contributed to poverty and reduction in poverty over the past 2 to 3 decades. And that process will continue. But there is a risk of basic types of gains we saw in terms of trade integration, in terms of financial integration, could be curtailed because of this crisis, as countries would like to impose own sectors and we know that these types of policies backfired in the past, and our hope is that there won't be implemented. Let me stop and quickly here and turn to Justin, JD, whether he has any views about the advanced economies trade policies. JD?
Yes, I would just say that this is not the moment for protectionism. Very clearly, we know that there are important gains to diversification in trade and global trade. And this is a good time to look at every option available to try to diversify. I think there are important risks associated with bringing back your production onshore. You also concentrate the risks geographically if, let's say, there was to be a new outbreak in your country. So if anything, what we're seeing in this current situation with different outbreaks of different intensities and different shutdowns across different countries, that there is a key role for diversification of value chains.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think that, yes. Again, we have some questions from other media as well. There's another question from a media, and which asked, and recently OECD also published global economic growth forecast and said global economy this year will decrease by 6%. Do you think the global economic growth forecast from World Bank will be further lowered, or not? And if so, why? And also the second question is, what measures should emerging markets and developing economy like China to take to stabilize the foreign trade situation and finance to deal with the global economic downturn?
Thank you. Both of these questions are important. I cannot comment on the forecasts of other institutions. The only thing I can tell you is that we use what we call market exchange rate based weights when we compute global growth. OECD uses what is called purchasing power parity weights to compute their growth numbers. So in our case, this 5.2% comes with a range, as I mentioned, the range. So 4 and 8 of the range, the forecast fundamental difference, how we calculate the growth rates. When we use, for example, the PPP weights, our number is around 4%. On the second question, I'm going to ask Eka quickly respond how China can approach the trade policy issues. Eka, you have any views on that?
Yes, I will start, and I will maybe Martin can then also give his views.
Yeah.
Very quickly, and this is related to our projections and the first question. China is a large economy which is relatively less open than other emerging market developing economies in terms of share of exports to GDP, clearly was not affected so much by spillovers, external spillovers. Because if you read the report, it says that countries which were disproportionately affected by this current shock are not only countries which had suffered from domestic lockdowns, but also from spillovers too, what Ayhan mentioned, commodities, tourism, and trade, right? Now, what is very important is that as China recovers, and again, that goes back to the point that Ayhan has alluded to about recovery and damage to potential growth, then spillovers are very important for China. And this is related to productivity. This will come through technology, through investment. And that's why I think altogether trade and investment is going to play very important role for China. So saying that, what we are seeing again from the report that clearly you will see external demand contracting and being very weak for a long time, where China has potential to boost its growth, both on demand side in short term to reduce its output gap is through demand side policies. And then more on a longer term, as I said, to also not allow potential growth to slow too rapidly through focusing on policies in terms of openness, technology, absorption, and then clearly innovation. And in there, I would turn to Martin, and then we share views that how important is for China to stay open and especially still use its huge savings in terms of, in this particular moment, support perhaps global growth. Martin, to you.
Well, I mean, let me try and put it into a very simple formula. I think in the past, for China, trade was, in the first instance, a source of external demand and a way to grow through exports. I think going forward, trade for China is going to have to become increasingly a source of imports of goods and services to continue to allow new technologies to diffuse through the economy, and to provide the kind of market demand for the global economy that China, as a global trading power, will need for the global economy to do well, and as a result for China to do well within it. So I think in the current stage of the global economy, for China to hope to grow out of this crisis through exports is going to be quite difficult. But if it pursues a strategy of keeping its own market open, it will, as a result, help other countries grow more rapidly, and that in itself will create additional demand for China's goods and service exports. So being open for China has a different significance, I think, in the time ahead than it used to do in the past. But it's nonetheless, it's nonetheless important for China to maintain, its strategy towards increasing opening up. And I'm very pleased always when in China, the term of reform and opening up is almost, is always used together. And I think that's a very good way of describing what should be the policy orientation going forward, just as it has been, by and large over the last 40 years.
Okay, thank you, Akinina, and also Martin for your great points. I think that absolutely right. Yeah, China actually is uphold its open door policy, and we see the new Premier's working report at MPC stress heavily on the high level opening up, and we see China quickly followed that Hainan Island now become the largest free trade port in China, and they're going to implement 15% income tax and the corporate tax possible as well. So we see, your analysis that really blend well into that, because China have more openness. China has recently, ExxonMobil has opened a 10 billion ethylene plant in Guangdong, and then we have seen Walmart plant have opened 500 new outlets in China. We see Honeywell is having new regional emerging market head office in Wuhan opened recently. So there's many, I think many signs that China is open. The market access is even further relaxed, and also with the 5G now, China is mapping out all stations of that. So there's more new forms of import are needed to upgrade the technology demand for China, which in turn will stimulate other countries' economy as well. So this is really great suggestions you made. We have another final public question from Time Finance, which is also a media here that joined us live tonight, and they want to ask a question by themselves. So let's put them in for their questions. We have already now about over 700,000 viewers online. So your topic is really attractive. So many people tuned in. Is the time finance still there? It's not on? No? Okay. Anyway, he left his question here. He said, affected by pandemic, Federal used, the Fed, which means US, the radical monetary policy. Also, it seems, quantitative easing as well. So it seems that Fed, may be using some of its monetary policies, and then maybe other countries may have the risk of that. So with that, the dollar dominance in the global economy, would that really have an impact on the economy? Maybe we have our U.S. experts on. JD, you can. I don't know.
Yes, happy to take that question. I think the best way to interpret the Fed's activities is by looking at its mandate in terms of meeting its inflation target and securing maximum employment. And it's really doing everything it possibly can to support growth in the United States. And the major channel through its, for that effort is the improvement in the financial conditions. So the Fed is trying to keep the financial conditions as accommodative as possible to support the recovery that we're seeing gradually in the data as the US economy opens up. Now, given the importance of the US economy and the global economy, there will be positive spillovers from that demand boost that comes from the Fed policies helping the US economy recover. So overwhelmingly, that will help and be a positive force for the global economy going forward.
Okay, great. Thanks, JD, for your comments. I think we probably come to the conclusion of our webinar, and then this live global economic prospect report, which World Bank has just released. World Bank China and World Bank head office in Washington joined us tonight for this excellent presentation exchanges. So we have the new forecast from the World Bank, and we see this actually the China and the East Asian regions is probably the only region left in the world that may still have a positive growth this year, which is kind of encouraging, but also we want to hope for the next next year everybody will be back to normal. So finally, maybe we have all of you have each conclude as one sentence, one or two sentences for our seminar webinar tonight. And so what do you see the economy of the global economy in the next year or two? And what do you think post-pandemic multilateralism, globalization, and global cooperation, a global health system will be taking a direction? What direction we take? So maybe briefly, we would like to have your concluding remarks. Probably we'll start with Dr. Kose, if you can hear on that.
Yes. Henry, let me thank you again for organizing this event, and I'm very appreciative of your staff putting together this very quickly. For us, it was a great opportunity to reach a large audience. Our colleagues in China country office, especially Martin, joined us tonight. I think we just need to accept the reality. This is a tough period. The policymakers need to be alert and continue providing the necessary support. The framework through these issues in terms of global economy. Hopefully, the policymakers will realize that collaboration, coordination is always the better option going forward in terms of promoting growth and in terms of addressing these global problems. I would like to be optimistic and end with that optimistic note. But let me stop there. Thank you again for organizing the event.
Thank you, Dr. Kose. Yeah, maybe we have Martin. You have your final word.
I think it's always good to close on an optimistic note, and in development, I think one needs to be a professional optimist. I think what this crisis, or for lack of a better word, has confirmed once again is how closely we are all tied together. I was impressed by the slide that Ayhan showed, that this is the most synchronized global recession that we have seen in the data so far. And I think that figure alone, that 95% of the world's economies are experiencing a recession at the same time, just shows you that the world is interconnected. And I think that in itself is probably the strongest argument for trying to solve the world's problems in a similarly interconnected and cooperative way. That is not to deny that there are strong differences of opinion, and sometimes there are strong differences of interest, but without finding a way to resolve them in interaction with each other, I think we'll all be ultimately worse off. The World Bank is a multilateral organization. We exist because we believe that cooperative global solutions are the right way to go. And I think this crisis has certainly not weakened my conviction in that regard. And I hope that we can make progress on the many issues that we face together, from climate change to dealing with debt to many other issues, trade, etc. So thank you again, Henry, for this opportunity, and thanks to everybody that joined this conversation. Is really very valuable for us, and we look forward to further reactions. And of course, the World Bank office here in Beijing is ready to receive also further reactions that people may have after this call through our colleagues here on the ground. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martin, and great comments as well. And I really appreciate your optimism, and also we are all in the same boat. You're absolutely right. Maybe perhaps Kathleen now, your final comment?
Yes, so first of all, again, thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. I really want to express great appreciation for that. In terms of how I see the future, I would say that, as Martin said, that first of all, we saw how closely really world is connected, but I will add to that. We also, I think this crisis showed us, and that's what also Ayhan said, at how realistic are some tail risks, which is related to whether it is pandemics or whether it will be related to nature. So balanced and sustainable growth is becoming even more important. Equitable, balanced, sustainable growth. Those dimensions will come at the fore and should be propelling growth in future. And also the last point, when we talk about the channels, the spillovers, and then impact in future negative, I would say that confidence is perhaps central. And confidence is related, like business confidence, consumer confidence. In that sense, de-escalating tensions and resuming the global cooperation is essential for reducing, right, global uncertainty and improving confidence. So I would conclude there, and thank you again very much, and wish you luck. Bye.
Thank you, Kalina. Thank you very much for your also very positive comments. I would like to have the JD. You have your final word, please, as well.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I would conclude maybe on a sobering note to say that what we see for the outlook for the global economy and advanced and emerging economies going forward is a difficult road to recovery. So we've had many successes in containing the virus across the world. At the same time, the virus is still with us, and it will be with us for quite some time until herd immunity can be reached, until a vaccine can be developed. And so during that time, it will be difficult to normalize economic activity. So we're seeing some very positive signs in certain countries. In other countries, we're seeing maybe some worrying signs that the outbreak is not under control. But this will be with us for quite some time. And therefore, although we're bouncing back into growth in 2021, that growth is expected to be fairly modest relative to the size of the shock that we've experienced in 2020.
Thank you, JD, and thank you for all those great predictions. I think we have reached the end of our webinar tonight, and I really appreciate the senior World Bank expert to give us the most latest analysis, expert analysis of the global economy and global economic prospect. A new report, a flagship report that you just released, and also our discussion around the world, but also our focus on China as well. I agree with that no country is isolated, it's not an island, and we are all living this together. And this shows how important that globalization and the multilateralism is really needed, because we can't fight this on our own, and we have to respect the health of the mankind, the health of the environment, and we have to really stick to keep the climate change under control, and so that we don't have more surprises and more punishment probably from the universal nature to the humankind. So I think a strong pillar like a World Bank that has been supporting the world development since the Bretton Woods system, I mean, for so many years, and your expertise and your advice is always appreciated, and then your analysis is really has a great stimulating impact, I think, not only for China, but for the rest of the world. So once again, I would like to thank all of you very much, particularly Dr. Martin Razor, the World Bank Director for China, Mongolia, and presentation tonight by Dr. Ayhan Kose, Director of the World Bank Group's Prospect Group, which is a very famous group now. And also we have the panelists. I want to thank Justin Damon Gurnett. He's the Senior Economist, Development Prospect Group of World Bank. And also Ms. Akena Vashamadezi, Senior Country Economist, Global Macroeconomic Trends, team of the Development Prospect Group, World Bank. So also we have almost 800,000 viewers one way or the other joined us. I want to thank our viewers, all the academic, think tank, policy, business, and all our ordinary viewers here in China and probably around the world. So once again, thank you very much. And we conclude tonight the special presentation by the World Bank on the global economic prospect. And thank you very much. Thank you. We'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.